Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host, Eloise Parker.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us as we provide an update on the Census Bureau's thinking with regard to ensuring the confidentiality of the current population survey public use file. My name is Eloise Parker, and I'm the Assistant Director for Demographic Programs at Census. I'll provide a bit of background on this issue and then turn it over to my colleagues, Gary Benedetto, the Census Bureau's Assistant Division Chief for the Center for Enterprise Dissemination Disclosure Avoidance, who will discuss a hybrid suppression modeling approach to protecting geographies at population levels where we've found vulnerabilities. Kira Lindsay, the Bureau's Survey Director for the current population survey, will talk to you about an updated proposal for rounding wages, which is a more modest proposal than what was initially put out earlier this year. As you know and appreciate, the Census Bureau is obligated by federal law to ensure data are protected from disclosure, and specifically that no individual respondent can be identified in data released to the public. As you also know, the amount of data available and the technologies and methods to match them have made it more and more challenging to meet this obligation. The CPS PUF is no exception to these challenges, and in 2020, the Census Bureau conducted a rigorous re-identification study on the PUF, and we found that there were vulnerabilities to disclosure on select geographies with populations less than 250,000. The established disclosure protection on the CPS PUF is to suppress geographies with populations less than 100,000, clearly no longer sufficient. So in January of this year, the Census Bureau announced plans to apply more rigorous protection to the file. The CPS PUF user community expressed a number of concerns about how that plan would impact the utility of the file in general, but particularly given the pandemic and the centrality of the CPS PUF to understanding dynamics in the labor economy. Users expressed concerns about the additional geographic suppression, but there were other concerns as well that we're seeking to address. These included a decision by the Bureau to replace the PUF household identifier, precluding year-over-year analyses, and doing so at a particularly sensitive period in the US economy, given the pandemic and associated stressors. Plans for rounding data on usual weekly earnings and usual hourly earnings would constrain analysis on wage growth and compromise inputs for tools like the Atlanta Federal Reserve Wage Tracker. And then, of course, the Bureau was going to need time to apply the new methods, which would have had the effect of delaying the release of the PUF. In light of these concerns, the Bureau committed to take another look at its plan and find a way to avoid this level of impact on the data user community. The changes were deferred and the PUF was released on schedule. Nonetheless, the disclosure risks are real. And while the Bureau believes the proposal we're sharing with you today will have less impact on the data, there is no option that allows us to sidestep the need for additional protection. By sharing this proposal today and inviting comment, we are confident we can strike the right balance between these needs. We are inviting comment through July 15th, and Kira will review the mechanics of that at the end of this presentation. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Gary Benedetto to review the proposal. Gary?
Thanks, Eloise. So as Eloise mentioned, the established practice is for the CPS public use file to suppress geographies for populations of less than 100,000. And we have now identified this vulnerability that too many sample population uniques enter into the sample, even for geographies with populations below 250,000. We are trying to be responsive to the feedback on the initial suggestion of suppressing geographies below 250,000. And so we are proposing an alternative that would allow the same level of geographic detail as we used to have on the CPS public use file, by modeling geography just for the geos that fall below the 250,000 threshold. And rounding of wage and earnings is still something of concern, but we believe that much less aggressive rounding is possible than the earlier proposal. Next slide. So I thought it would be helpful to walk through an imaginary example to explain the mechanics of our proposal. So here we have an imaginary state AA, and it has 9 geographies that enter into the public use or the CPS. Under the internal column, we have our internal GeoID and metropolitan status. And then there's a size category for each of these geographies. As you can see, under the old public use file methodology, several of these, 4, 7, 8, and 9, would have their GeoID turned to 0, essentially suppressed, to accommodate the 100,000 population threshold that we used to abide by. With the new 250,000 threshold, we would also have to suppress GeoIDs 5 and 6. However, the ramifications are even larger than that because, as you can see, when combined with metropolitan status, 8 and 9 would also fall together as unidentified GeoIDs, but non-metropolitan status would also fall under the 250,000 threshold. So we would have to, unfortunately, suppress metropolitan status for all of the unidentified geos. So this has large impact on the usability of the data. So the proposal would be to use a partial synthesis. So in particular, we would estimate a multinomial logistic regression predicting which small geography a household is in based on characteristics of the household and the householder. And then we would take a draw from the posterior predictive distribution to replace the small geography for those at-risk households. A separate regression would be estimated for each state, and only households within these small geographies would be impacted, and only their geography variables. The idea would be to take a data-driven approach. So we would throw as many candidate explanatory variables at the household and householder level in as possible into this model, and let the data determine the most important relationships using robust statistical methods so that our own models of what is important aren't driving the synthesis. So going back to the geographies I showed you before, the colored geographies here show the 4 different values of the dependent variable that would be modeled for this hypothetical state. One would be the GeoID 0 metro, GeoID 5 metro, GeoID 6 metro, and GeoID 0 non-metro. Those 4 values would be the values of the dependent variable modeled. So going into a little bit more detail into the mechanics of this, here is an illustration with hypothetical microdata from this same hypothetical state. So as you can see, the internal GeoID is grayed out here because we wouldn't actually provide that. The old public use GeoID is in the 4th column there, but we will no longer be able to provide that. If we pursued suppression, the highlighted values from the old would become the highlighted values for the hypothetical suppressed GeoID. And this would affect just these first 5 observations. But we lose a lot of detail. Our proposal, again, would only affect these first 5 observations and would only affect the GeoIDs, but we would replace the GeoID with the modeled value. Something important to note here, there is no restriction on the model to predict the original value. So in this particular example, 3 of the cases, we produce the exact same value as the original value that the original old public use file methodology would have produced. However, we change it up often enough to provide uncertainty into exactly which geography people fall into for these small geographies. So these two cases were changed. So what are the implications to the data users here? Well, first of all, what stays the same? All analyses at the state and higher level, including analyses that don't condition on geography at all, will remain exactly the same. The only variables being touched are the geography variables, and they're only being touched for the cases that fall into these small geographies. Therefore, all analyses that condition on geographies that have a population of at least 250,000 will also remain the same. What changes are analyses that condition on geographies that have a population below the 250,000, and in particular, the metropolitan versus non-metropolitan in states where this distinction causes geos to fall below 250,000. But what's important to note is that the alternative is suppression, and suppression will also affect these analyses. The analyses below the 250,000 will not even be possible, and the metro-non-metropolitan distinction will also be affected because many of these cases will be turned to unidentified, and analyses that drop those from their analysis will suffer from bias. So I think now Kira will take over to talk about rounding.
Thanks, Gary. As an additional way to protect the data, we are looking to round reporting of wages and earnings. With the synthesis of the geographies, this can now be very minimal to just remove data that are very unique. The table here shows the proposal for hourly wages, and we would do a very similar rounding scheme for weekly wages. It is a dynamic rounding scheme taking into account the distributions of values reported. So for example, a reported value here of $14.81 would be rounded to $14.80. We would also no longer have to set a top code. We'll no longer have to do a set top code, and we will set it dynamically each month to the top 3%. This amount would be the average weight of those values. In addition, we would flag all cases that were reported below the federal minimum wage to make the value clear. To see all the details, please see the proposal paper on the CPS website. We want to reiterate that all of these changes would be phased in over time. These changes would be applied only to new sample for the month and then carried forward. There would be no break in series on a reporting of any case. It would take about 16 months to phase in fully. So what are the next steps? As Eloise pointed out, this is a proposal. We are looking for feedback from our data users. We will be taking comments through July 15th, and depending on comments, testing, and the final data disclosure review, we are looking to finalize the plan in September. The goal is to implement for the January data collection, the data release of the February 3rd report. On the slide, you will see the email address that you can send comments to. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, and we thank you for your time. At this point, we will take questions.
Thanks, Kara. So, Carolyn, if you note any questions, suggestions, or comments, I know it's a big job to sit and curate those. Please feel free to read those out.
Gary, we have a question asking about the movement of records between small geographies. The question comes from Danielle asking, is that movement limited to within state? And how does it affect overall socioeconomic characteristics of the households in those states?
So yes, that was absolutely one of the important things that we wanted to respect. There will be a separate regression run for each state, and the imputation will happen, the synthesis will happen entirely within each state. So yeah, nobody will be moving out of the state. As far as the impacts go, that's something that we'll have to study. But again, the alternative is suppression. So, you know, the idea of the multinomial logistic regression and throwing in all the characteristics of the household and the householder is that many of these things can be preserved. And so that there is still a lot of analytic utility for many analyses as a result, whereas suppression would completely eliminate that possibility.
Gary, we have a follow-up question. How similar is the small area modeling to the modeling used in the 2020 decennial data?
So I'm not necessarily an expert on the modeling the 2020 decennial data, so I don't want to speak too much to that, but it is a very different framework, privacy framework that we're pursuing here. This is not a formally private framework. It is based off of the multiple imputation literature. This would only be a single synthetic value that we make, but it is based from the multiple imputation data synthesis literature, if you're familiar with that or want to look into that.
Thanks, Gary. We have a question asking for further explanation on what a unique wage observation is.
So all we mean by that is that we're looking to eliminate any very specific reporting of wages that might, along with the demographic data or the labor force data, could help identify a person. So we're looking to eliminate the one reporting of a, say, just for example, $15.23 hourly wage that might be able to be linked to a specific job or person.
Our next question is, would these changes affect the ability to match individual respondents across 12 months? Additionally, would it appear that the answer is no, because you don't mention suppressing the household identifier as was contemplated earlier.
Right. So we will not be suppressing the household identifier. That's why we're phasing it in. We are probably going to reapply a new housing identifier system, but all cases will be able to be linked across 12 months.
Next question. What checks are done to ensure the risk was reduced and the data utility was retained? Are all records in those areas of 100,000 to 250,000 involved in the data replacement?
So yes, all records in the vulnerable populations are involved in the partial synthesis. As a result, the uncertainty there mimics the uncertainty of suppression. It will be a little more privacy leakage than suppression, but not significantly more. Data synthesis is a method that is well known to protect privacy at a very high level. So the broad relationships can be retained, but the vulnerability is addressed.
Kira, did you have a follow-up to one of your earlier responses?
Yeah, I just wanted to make it clear when I mentioned the new HHID system, that would be also only applied to the new cases coming in. So there wouldn't be a change to what you've been using now.
Next question. Would you consider a flag for those records where the new imputed or reported values are different from the actual values?
I mean, we can consider it. If you put in your comments to an email what you would like to see.
Could one of the panelists say how the Census Bureau interprets a violation of confidentiality protection under Title III? Does that confidentiality mean there is zero probability of someone being identified in the census data is released? I'm going to assume that 3 is meant to be Title 13.
So yes, assuming that it is Title 13, yes, Title 13 requires that when we put data in the public domain, that there is no opportunity for someone to re-identify an individual or a household. So we work towards, when we identify vulnerabilities and we can see that that possibility exists, we are compelled to take measures to correct that. And obviously, in this case, we want to do it in a way that preserves the maximum amount of utility to the CPS data user while we are meeting our legal obligation at the Census Bureau. John, did you want to add anything to that?
Good afternoon, everyone. I was just going to elaborate that for decades, the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board and before them, the Microdata Review Board had internal standards for the probability of a correct re-identification that set thresholds for making stronger disclosure avoidance procedures. And those internal standards actually have not changed very much over time, but they are Title 13 confidential. So an analysis crossed one, and that's what triggered the extra protections.
Okay, so there's several parts to the question, so I will go slowly. So let's say we're using a classification approach that combines state and metro status. For example, Wyoming Metro, Wyoming non-metro. Are we correct in understanding that if a state metro combination falls below 250,000 individuals, the proposed method will essentially inject noise such that an individual record may or may not actually fall within its apparent state metro category? If that's not quite right, could you walk us through how the proposal would operate in this scenario?
I think if I followed that question correctly, that is correct. If a household originally in the internal file falls into a geography within a state as defined by its GeoID and its metropolitan status, that would be under the 250,000 threshold, it would be eligible for, it would be part of this partial synthesis. Now, the partial synthesis model may predict it to land in the same one that it was originally in, but it may not also. That added uncertainty is what provides the protection. And it will make that prediction based off of a model that takes into account many or all of the covariates and allows the data to determine the important relationships. So it won't be our decision on what relationships are being preserved. It will be the data informing the model.
We have a question related to the impacts on sponsor agencies. Can you speak to the impacts on sponsor agencies and federal statistics, such as release of labor force, poverty statistics, and others? Will there be a delay in when data is released to sponsor agencies?
There should not be, no.
We have a question regarding geographies. What are the types of geographies affected? Counties, CBSAs, cities, and metro, non-metro classification?
Yeah, I mean, basically everything you mentioned except for state is potentially affected if the combination of those things falls under this 250,000 threshold.
Gary, we have a follow-up question to the scenario you addressed a moment ago. Is it GeoID plus metro status, GeoID only, metro status only, or any combination of those things being below 250,000 that would trigger the proposed method?
It's the combination of the metro status and the GeoID. And those things are tied to all the other things you mentioned earlier, such as county. And
we do have a question here that's related to the ACS, which I'm not sure someone on our panel will be able to address, but the question is, does this mean that the PUMA will no longer be available in the ACS public use file? John, are you able to respond to that question?
Yes, I can take that one. These determinations for the current population survey are independent of ongoing disclosure avoidance, modernization, and tests for the ACS. So it doesn't have any implication at the moment for the ACS public use file.
And we had one more comment in the thread so far that is looking for confirmation that researchers will be able to continue to readily access CPS data without working from a special location.
The public use file will still be posted monthly for anybody to use.
We've had a new comment added. The new rounding appears to have only minimal impact on the Atlanta Fed wage growth tracker based on initial computation, since most hourly wages are reported to 5 cents already. Most of the impact comes when imputing hourly wages from using weekly wages and usual hours because the rounding is more common for weekly earnings than hourly earnings. Thank you very much for adding that to the conversation. The question, what are the thoughts relating to estimating the precision? Will there be guidance provided to users on how to compute the variances, or will imputation error variance be ignored due to the single imputation approach?
So I'm not sure if this is for me or not, but I think that is something we can discuss how to do properly in the future. Definitely a multiple imputation approach would make that possible, and I don't know if that is on the table. That might be something that we can do in the background and provide some sort of general variance factor. I don't want to speak too much about things that have not yet been determined. I will say, though, that many of the disclosure avoidance and statistical disclosure limitation and the imputation that has nothing to do with disclosure methods in the past do affect some of these variance measures in ways that we haven't been able to account for in the past. So this isn't, if we do end up with a single imputation, this isn't totally a new problem.
Will there be a delay in posting the PUF to the census website relative to the very quick posting of the PUF currently?
No, our goal is to post it at the same time.
Will subpopulation analyses be valid?
So yes, there will be a little added uncertainty because of the partial synthesis. However, there would be even less, there would even be more uncertainty with suppression. Certain things wouldn't be possible and other things would be badly biased.
We have a follow-up question, another follow-up question to our earlier scenario. So if state plus metro status, that is without GeoID, does not fall under 250,000, the proposed method will not apply. Question?
But if I follow that, that's correct.
Once the geographic synthesis model is finalized, will the Bureau share a list of the explanatory variables with data users?
I don't know the answer to that. I will say that we really mean it when we say we're going to try to throw as much as possible into it. I think we can take that under advisement. We do have to always be cautious with any statistical disclosure limitation method that isn't formally private about revealing too many details, but we will definitely take that under advisement.
And that addresses all the questions and comments that we have received thus far in the chat that I have seen.
I do want to just reiterate a point that Kira made, which is that there is a brief technical paper that lays this out narratively for people for whom that is an extra bit of help. And that paper is available through the same location on census.gov where you joined this webinar. It's in the sort of preamble for the webinar. If there is someone other than myself who can grab that link and throw it in the chat, that would be fantastic. And otherwise, we will continue to take comments, feedback, thoughts, ideas, questions until the 15th of July at the email address, again, in that preamble. And very, very much appreciate your participation and your questions and your flexibility in terms of helping us work this through and hitting the sweet spot between our obligations to protect and your needs. So if, Carolyn, there are no additional questions.
Eloise, we did just receive one additional question. Will unrounded versions and previously available geographic detail be available via an FSRDC?
I think, again, we're probably not in a position to say yay or nay to that yet. But again, excellent point, and we'll take that to think through. All right. Lisa, I think that may close us out.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.